Xtalks connects professionals in the life science, medical device, and food industries with useful content like webinars, job openings, articles, and virtual meetings to help you succeed in your career. This food industry-focused podcast brings together some of our editorial staff to share insights into the latest B2B industry news to help keep you up to date.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Xtalks Food Podcast. I'm Sydney Perlmutter, Senior Food Industry Journalist and Webinar Moderator at Xtalks.com, and this week I'm joined by special guest Cally Edgren. Cally is a PFAS expert and the Senior Director of Sustainability at Assent, a leader in supply chain sustainability management solutions. So, Cally, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So just before I get into some questions, could you explain to our audience what PFAS is, sort of in layman's terms, and why it's so abundant in the food industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So PFAS, or PFAS, is an acronym. It stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It is a family of synthetic chemicals. They've been around since the 1930s. And they have been heavily used in countless applications because their chemical structure gives them some very good characteristics, such as waterproofing or oil proofing, even electrical insulation. You see PFAS a lot used for non-stick surfaces as well, even on things like your dental floss. So because of all of these properties, they really have found their way into a lot of different applications. And you can imagine the oil proofing, for example, is one reason that PFAS get used heavily in food packaging, just to make sure, that oil isn't leaking through the bag or whatnot. So yeah, they're very prevalent in the food packaging industry, but really they're very prevalent in every industry because they've had a long time. The thing about PFAS is that they don't break down. That's what gives them those great material properties, but they don't break down. So if they do get into your body or the environment, they're considered to be persistent, and some PFAS have been linked to some adverse health effects. So while they've been around for a long time, they have a lot of great material characteristics. There's a growing body of evidence that these may not be so healthy for us. And so we're starting to see a lot of regulatory pressure on manufacturers to find ways to achieve those same results without using the synthetic PFAS chemicals.
Wonderful. And just a bit about you. Can you just tell me a little bit about your education and professional journey that led you to become an expert in PFAS chemicals?
Yeah, there's no degree for PFAS for sure. I'm actually an industrial engineer from the University of Wisconsin, and I started working in manufacturing back in the 1990s in Milwaukee. And as part of that work in manufacturing, I got pulled into more of the safety side of things, which turned into product safety, which led into kind of a hazardous chemicals focus for my career. So I've worked with hazardous chemicals on the manufacturing side, and I've worked with hazardous chemicals on the product design side, which is where I am now. PFAS, again, they're heavily used not just in products, but in the manufacturing processes. So this really is one topic that is kind of branched over both sides of my career, so to speak. But the laws are coming very rapidly. And since I focus on the regulatory obligations around hazardous substances, you can imagine PFAS is taking up more and more of my bandwidth because the laws are coming quickly. But it's not just PFAS, that's just the main focus that I have today.
And I've covered PFAS before. I think I've heard of it as referred to as forever chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
And they're obviously gaining a lot of media coverage and regulation right now. And you sort of touched on this a little bit, but why so much attention right now?
Yeah, I think that it's been a slow burn. It does seem to be getting a lot of attention right now, but actually regulators have been very concerned about PFAS for several decades. The PFAS that is a component of the original Scotch Guard, PFOS, hasn't been manufactured in the United States since the early 2000s, after the EPA came to agreement with the chemical manufacturers. So, that's over 20 years ago. PFOA, which is another, the original Teflon, hasn't been manufactured here since 2015. So I wouldn't say that the concerns from the government side are new, but they do seem to be ramping up and getting amplified. One area that a lot of our customers and are concerned about is actually the state level regulations. So I think the states are really turning up the pressure on PFAS from a regulatory standpoint, in part because they don't want to wait anymore for some type of federal restriction. And also because they are the ones who are having to deal with some of the remediation of contamination, like water supplies or soil or air. And if they're the ones who have to remediate that, they're looking for ways to stop the contamination now. So I think there's a lot of different things at play here with PFAS that are unique to this PFAS story. That haven't really occurred before, but I wouldn't say it's new. I do think the Hollywood movie Dark Waters a few years ago definitely brought extra attention to PFAS. In fact, Dark Waters just came out on Netflix, so I'm expecting that maybe more people will suddenly start asking about PFAS if they see that movie. But I do think that has drawn a little bit of extra attention lately.
And I know that a federal PFAS ban was proposed just last month in April. And if it is passed, how do you think that this will impact businesses, and specifically the food business?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it'll be a major change in operations and manufacturing, and not just because it will prohibit PFAS in your products, which could be a real challenge for the food packaging industry, because again, you're using PFAS for some very important things, like not having oil seep through packaging. And there aren't always easy replacements for PFAS out there. That's just it. They've been used for 70 years unchecked. Nobody's been trying to develop replacements for them. So I do think a federal ban would be very challenging for the food packaging industry and manufacturers. But there are already many states that have bans on these particular materials. At least a dozen of them have already prohibited PFAS from food packaging. So the federal ban will be very impactful, but really should not overlook all of the state bans that are already in place around these materials. The other area that a federal ban could be impactful is not just on what you sell, but what you need in order to manufacture. So even materials that aren't part of your final product or your final packaging, you may have difficulty, for example, maintaining your machinery or plastic molding parts because you may not be able to get PFAS anymore that are critical to those processes. So, I always advise my clients, it's important to look at the products and you're selling and what's allowed in those products, of course, but please do not overlook the amount of PFAS that you need just to run your factories. And if those PFAS are suddenly not available, you could have a line down situation.
And I was just going to ask, given there's a recent EPA rule, are there any, could you share some of the latest developments in tech or best practices that businesses are adopting to remove PFAS from their products and their processes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the first step is you need to know where the PFAS are, right? You can't come up with a strategy until you know where they are. And unless you are the one who bought a drum of chemicals and added it to yourself, a lot of manufacturers are probably buying materials from a supplier that already have PFAS in them. So what our clients are doing is querying their suppliers, which, by the way, is what the EPA recommends under their TSCA Section 8A7 reporting rule. The best way to know what PFAS are there and why they're there is to ask whoever put them there in the first place. So if it's not you, you have to go back to your suppliers, and you need to make sure your suppliers are asking their suppliers, right? But really, that's the best way to approach it. And again, that's what regulators are recommending. The reason for this is because most PFAS can't be tested for yet. They've actually not developed the test methodology for more than a few dozen PFAS chemicals. And they can only be tested and detected down to a certain level. So if you have lower levels or trace elements of PFAS, even an analytical test may not tell you that. So again, because the test methodology hasn't really caught up yet to the 16,000 PFAS that the EPA has identified, really asking your supply chain is the best practice at this point. Once you identify the PFAS, then you can start figuring out what your next steps are. Do we really need it in that particular application? Is that manufacturer going to obsolete it? Because if it's coming from 3M, it's going to be obsoleted. Is there a replacement for it? So again, these are all standard questions that you would ask around an obsolescence, but you don't know what your risks are until you find out where the PFAS are in the first place.
And you were mentioning, Dark Waters is coming out on Netflix. So in terms of consumers, as they learn more about the potential risks of PFAS, in the meantime, is there anything that they can do to minimize their exposure?
Absolutely. So I personally, I had my blood tested a few months ago for PFAS. There's a national test lab that will do tests for 9 different PFAS. I had PFAS in my blood. That was not a surprise because estimates are that 97% of Americans have PFAS in their blood. I was pleased to see I was below the national averages, but I'm going to get it done again next year just to see if those numbers go down, because I have made some changes in my personal life. So I try to avoid plastic food containers as much as possible, not just for PFAS, but for other chemicals. So I only, drink water out of glass bottles, for example. I've switched my dental floss. That's a key way to get PFAS into your body is through your dental floss, if you can believe it. I've switched my cookware. So non-stick surfaces, even if they say things like PFOA free, that doesn't mean a different PFAS compound isn't there. So really the only way to truly get away from PFAS in your cookware is to shift away from nonstick cookware. So I have gone to cast iron, which, is a bit of a lifestyle adjustment, but really trying to get away from the food and water contact materials, because of course that's the easiest way to get PFAS into your body, right? So those are things that you can do. Even things like I don't do microwave popcorn. That's another example. But these are all personal choices I've made. I've stopped wearing waterproof makeup. Anything that's waterproof, oil-proof, non-stick. These are really 3 key words that you could look at in your personal life to try to avoid. And again, especially focused on anything you would actually ingest. Those are just some easy starting points.
And in your opinion, how well do you think that consumers actually understand the risks associated with PFAS, and what role should the food industry or other businesses play in educating their consumers about these chemicals? Or is there, any education on their part that they need to do?
I think the average consumer is probably not aware of the risks. It's we're talking well over 10,000 chemicals, and these are synthetic chemicals. If you tell somebody lead pipes are bad for your drinking water to come through, we all took high school chemistry. I can understand lead is bad, right? When you start talking about tens of thousands of chemicals that could be in everything that you touch throughout the day, that's just a little harder to wrap your brain around. And they've been around, again, since before World War II. So I don't think most people understand them, and I don't think that manufacturers do them any favors by labeling things like PFOA free, because then the average consumer is going to think that means it's safe to use, and they don't understand, the complexities behind that statement, which, by the way, a lot of state laws are now saying you can't do that anymore if there's a different PFAS in the product. So I think the regulators are driving some manufacturers to have to do that education. You're going to start seeing labels on more and more consumer items that'll say PFAS free or PFC free. I think that's one way that manufacturers are going to be educating consumers. Now, that doesn't mean the consumer knows what that means, but I do think that the more people that see that movie, for example, they'll start to understand that there are a lot of health concerns. There's a lot of pressure on the states, again, to address this, and the states are moving very quickly. So last year, Minnesota released maybe the most aggressive state-level PFAS law in the nation, and it was about less than a 4-month turnaround time from start to finish. You don't see that at the federal level ever happening that fast. But we do see that at the state levels, and we're starting to see that happening more and more. So I think that the consumers, as they learn and get educated, they're going to put the pressure on the regulators who will pass these regulations that say things like, you can't label your cookware PFOA free. And those regulations are going to drive the manufacturers to do more education of the consumers. It'll be a little bit of a cycle there.
So how does the approach to PFAS regulation in the US compare with other countries, especially those in Europe or Asia? And are there any lessons that US businesses and regulators could learn from abroad?
Actually, in my line of work, we often are generally following European Union regulations. For example, the EU's REACH regulation drove a lot of manufacturers to make changes to how they address hazardous chemicals. But in this case, I would say the US is leading the way, especially again at the state level. But even at the federal level, the EPA has a TSCA reporting rule that starts, the reporting window opens this November and affects every single manufacturer in America who either makes PFAS or imports PFAS, which is an awful lot of companies. So I would say the US is actually leading the way on PFAS, and other countries are following. Now, the European Union is also very aggressive. They have proposed a full ban on PFAS. That's still in the proposal phase, and they're working through that right now. It would be under that REACH regulation. The US, again, as you mentioned, just a few weeks ago in Congress, they proposed a US level of full PFAS ban that would go into effect in 10 years. So fairly similar to what the EU is doing. I find outside of North America and Europe, the rest of the world follows mostly what the Stockholm Convention has added as far as PFAS goes. They're all signatories, 150 countries, 150 plus countries are signatories to the Stockholm Convention. There are 4 PFAS families that are listed on that convention as restricted. So the rest of the world is still doing a bit of a chemical by chemical approach. Again, over 16,000 PFAS. So restricting 4 of them is probably not as impactful as it may seem. But both the United States and the European Union are approaching this more from an all family type of restriction. And that's what's really going to be the game changer. So, but right now, I would say the US is definitely leading the way.
Interesting. Now, the new regulations and the public pressure to eliminate PFAS, I think they can be probably a little bit challenging for small businesses. So what support or resources are available to help these small businesses comply with new regulations?
Yeah, it is very challenging. And, honestly, I really feel for the small businesses. The EPA's TSCA reporting rule actually grants an additional 6 months for small businesses to finish their reporting. Of course, the downside of that is if those small businesses sell to large companies, their customers may not give them the extra 6 months because they don't have it. But there are some free resources out there. Even just tracking the regulations can be very challenging. There's 2 NGOs actually with free resources that I direct a lot of companies to. The first is saferstates.org. They do a really good job of tracking all of the state laws and what's developing around PFAS. They do other substances too, but PFAS especially. And the other is ChemSec, CHEMSEC. They're a Swedish NGO, and they have actually put together some fantastic resources for manufacturers to say, where's your biggest risk of PFAS? They even give some suggested alternatives. So those are some free, resources for small manufacturers to at least learn more about what's going on and what the challenges are. And again, maybe even some suggested alternatives for certain applications. But it is very difficult. It's not going to go away, though. And I think just avoiding it. My biggest concern is actually the companies that aren't focusing on it are suddenly one day going to have an obsolescence issue. So regulations aside, You have the chemical manufacturers like 3M who are saying, we're not going to make these anymore because we are facing a lot of litigation for past practices. So we're just going to stop making PFAS. And my biggest concern for manufacturers isn't the regulations, it's that they're not going to know that suddenly they won't get those parts tomorrow. And that's going to pose a whole host of other problems for them. So as difficult as it is for small manufacturers, I don't think this is something they can afford to avoid, because that obsolescence issue may catch them unaware.
Right. And looking forward, how do you foresee the role and the presence of PFAS in the food industry evolving? Any changes? Are there any changes that businesses should prepare for in the next 5 to 10 years if it won't be fully eliminated, but maybe just cut back on a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the great innovation opportunities around PFAS, of course, is necessity is the mother of invention, right? So can we find materials that will give those same desirable properties like grease proofing or waterproofing or non-stick surfaces on your pans? Can we find alternatives that are not fluorocarbons, right? And I think that, there's a lot of people working on this, and hopefully we will have some great breakthroughs. It really depends on the application and what they're using PFAS for, as to how readily a replacement is available. But I do think that we will see, 5 to 10 years from now, a lot more diversity in how you can achieve these properties without the PFAS themselves. But I do think we also, as a society, need to understand that we may lose some of those conveniences. So I mentioned the dental floss before. I just don't think the PFAS-free dental floss works quite as well. My cast iron cookware does take a little bit more work to maintain than the old Teflon pans, right? So I think we as consumers are going to have to also understand that we may have to give up some of those features that we've become accustomed to in order to have some healthier options. But as far as the industry goes, I think there is a lot of drive for innovation. And honestly, it's an opportunity. If companies can find ways to do this without PFAS, they could actually have a marketing advantage over some of their competitors. So maybe that's a positive way for some manufacturers to look at this. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of companies already that market things as PFAS free, even without having a regulation telling them that they have to do so. So, maybe we'll see some opportunities like that also driving that innovation. And again, 5 to 10 years from now, I think we'll see a lot more diversity of materials.
What this sort of reminds me of is the sort of drive to find new ingredients or food colorings or additives that are, less harmful.
Exactly.
Yeah. It really reminds me of that, because we see, and there's now a huge market for more natural ingredients. And I know that these things take a lot of time. So I definitely acknowledge that the slow phase out will certainly be slow, but hopefully, very worth it. And I could absolutely see a market for companies that are providing different types of solutions. So yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation. I've learned a lot. I'm going to go ahead and look at my dental floss when I go.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It makes a lot of sense.
I do think that we have a lot of good opportunities coming, but I do think one thing that the food, packaging manufacturers will have to understand is that customers who aren't educated about this may get a little grumpy that things aren't performing quite as well. So when you talked about marketing things as all natural or sustainable, I do think the messaging and marketing is going to be important, because if your products are perceived as suddenly not working as well, you do want to have that story behind it, right? So I think it is important to include your marketing teams in these discussions, and how will you educate your customers, because the performance may be slightly different and you want to get ahead of that.
All right. Thank you so much for being here. This was a fantastic conversation. I certainly learned a lot.
Thank you for having me, and good luck with the dental floss.
Thank you so much. All right. Well, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Food Podcast. If you like today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thanks, everyone, and see you next week. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Xtalks Food Industry Podcast. If you enjoyed our discussions today, please share the episode with your friends and colleagues, and be sure to subscribe in order to be notified when a new episode is released. To join in on the discussion, you can find Xtalks on social media, email podcast@xtalks.com, or comment on the articles directly. Links are in the show description. Take a moment to join our community at xtalks.com to get access to everything we have to offer, including webinars, job listings, virtual meetings, articles, and more. The views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the speakers sharing them. They should not be taken as professional advice and do not necessarily reflect the policy or position Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.